So the U.S.-China trade dispute is essentially about fairness. The U.S. has long complained that they're not treated fairly by the Chinese, that it costs too much to send American products into China, and along with that, the U.S. does not charge enough for Chinese products that come into the U.S. Now, this has been a topic of conversation for a long time. It's gone through multiple presidents, through administrations, through many Congresses. The thing is, nobody's ever really done very much about it. There have been a few measures here and there, some tariffs on Chinese products when they've tried to dump certain products into the U.S., but nothing as strenuous and nothing as concrete and nothing as serious as what the Trump administration has done with the tariffs that it's leveled against Chinese goods. Now, of course, the Chinese have countered with their own tariffs, but their retaliatory measures are somewhat limited in scope. So the Chinese basically have three ways that they can retaliate against the American tariffs. One, of course, is that they can level their own tariffs, and they have done that. Number two is that they can make it more difficult for U.S. companies to operate in China. Of course, the big one that comes to mind there is Apple. It could really make Apple's life miserable through a whole host of measures. The third thing that they can do, and this is what we call the nuclear option, is that they can either stop buying U.S. treasuries or they can actually start selling U.S. treasuries back into the market. Now, the reason why this is such an important thing and why we call it the nuclear option is because China is the largest holder in the world of U.S. debt. It's got over $1 trillion, close to $1.1 trillion in U.S. bonds, notes, bills, those sort of things. And the U.S. counts on China to buy up its debt. Of course, that's very important with the U.S. running nearly $1 trillion deficits, which are expected to continue as far as the eye can see. So if China is not a big player in that market, it could make life very difficult for the U.S. The idea of China going to the nuclear option is something that's been framed in the local media there, which of course is the state-run media, where they've talked about scholars studying this issue. Now, that's very calculated type of language where they say, okay, we're just going to study this, we're going to look at this. It's basically saber-rattling is what it really comes down to. They want the U.S. to know that this is something that's on the table. Everybody knows that the chances of China doing this aren't really good, but as the dispute goes on, and if the dispute continues to go on, which it's likely to do, becomes more and more of a possibility where China has to say, look, we can't match you dollar for dollar tariff-wise. That's the big thing for them because the U.S. obviously imports far more goods from China than the other way around. So if this continues to go on, if the stakes get higher, if feelings continue to get hurt, it becomes more and more of a viable possibility for China to step in and stop buying U.S. treasuries or sell them outright. The big thing for China is that if it does take this type of nuclear option, it will not go unscathed if it does something like that. Because look, China needs to hold U.S. treasuries. They're still the most liquid instrument in the world as far as fixed income goes. They carry a pretty decent yield on them. It also would weaken the U.S. dollar, which would make U.S. multinationals stronger, and it would just generally cause a crisis of confidence within the world that China is stepping away from this market. So there is damage that could be done, significant damage to the Chinese economy if it would step away from the market. Now, of course, that doesn't mean they won't do it. China is under a different political system than the U.S. President Trump and Congress, they have to answer to the American people. The way the Chinese government, the way their political system is set up, President Xi does not have to answer on the same level that President Trump does. So they can go ahead and they can sustain a little bit of damage. Of course, Chinese economy is still a very strongly growing economy. So they have a little bit of wiggle room here, but not a whole lot.